She may be the most famous and fascinating woman in the world. She's had some amazing jobs. First Lady of the United States, Senator from New York, Secretary of State, presidential candidate. And now, of course, all eyes are on Hillary Clinton to see whether she'll make another run for America's top political job. Jonathan Allen and Amie Parnes have chronicled the recent history of Hillary Rodham Clinton. It's all in their book, HRC, State Secrets and the Rebirth of Hillary Clinton. And they join us now from Washington, D.C. And Jonathan and Amie, it's good to have you on the program today. Amie, let me start with you, and for argument's sake, let's start our discussion with Hillary Clinton running against Barack Obama for the Democratic presidential nomination back in 2008. I want you to help us get into Hillary's mind when, one by one, longtime Clinton allies are, in effect, defecting to Obama. How shocked were the Clintons when this pattern began to repeat itself?
They were pretty shocked. I mean, you take Senator Ted Kennedy, they had helped him many times in the past, that they really expected him to be on their side. He wasn't on their side. And, you know, there were other people like Congressman Jason Altmaier who, you know, Hillary won his district in Ohio, and he still sat on the fence and didn't move in her direction. And she courted him, and he still kept saying, no, I can't commit to you. So they almost hated the people a little more who sat on the sidelines and didn't endorse, more than the ones who did endorse.
And Jonathan, someone in your book points out the fact that the Clintons have demonstrated more power to reward and or punish anyone in modern politics, and yet that didn't work for them for the 2008 nomination. How come?
I think part of the reason for that is that Barack Obama was such an appealing candidate to such a wide swath of the Democratic Party. First of all, his opposition to the Iraq War was very popular with liberals across the country. He obviously had a lot of support in the African-American community, and that, I think, affected the decision-making of the politicians who were picking between the two of them as superdelegates, basically people who had a little extra weighted vote at the Democratic National Convention. So I think that had a lot to do with it, that she was facing Barack Obama. Now, I also think that there were some people that didn't like the way that the Clintons played ball over the years, and that there were some people who didn't want to give them even more power to punish and reward by putting her back in the White House.
Her concession speech, when it became apparent that she was not going to be able to defeat Obama for the nomination, might have been the best speech she ever gave. Amie, what made it so memorable?
Well, there's the famous 18 million cracks line, for instance, that, you know, drew so much attention. But
the cracks in the glass ceiling, you mean?
Yes, the cracks in the glass ceiling, exactly. And that was a very powerful line, and it was sent to her actually by an aide who was working in California. He actually emailed it to her, and they stuck in that line, and that's probably the most memorable line of the campaign. But I think there was some dispute on how much she should embrace the fact that she was a woman candidate in the speech. And she had a young aide kind of push in that direction. You know, we have a scene in the book where they're all seated around, she and two aides are seated around her dining room table, and she's basically arguing with an aide or disagreeing with an aide about how much she should embrace the fact that she was a woman candidate, how much she should talk to her women supporters. The aide finally convinced her to do that, so she does. And, you know, it was a very powerful speech, and I think that when you talk to some of her aides now, they'll agree that it was the most powerful speech of her campaign.
Jonathan, of course, Obama wins that 2008 election. He defeats Senator John McCain. He sets up his cabinet, and much to everybody's shock, he offers Hillary Clinton the Secretary of State's job. Whose idea was that?
Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I think it was, you know, they say, when I say they, people who are familiar with the discussions about that say that President Obama had started to think about that in the summertime. He discussed it at some point with John Podesta, who had been Bill Clinton's chief of staff in the White House and was the head of the Obama transition team. It's possible that that discussion went the other way, that John Podesta actually brought it up with President-elect Obama, because that obviously happens occasionally where the principal gets credit for the great idea that somebody else had. But you know, I think it's something that was so shocking to so many people, and yet at the same time, from a political standpoint, made a ton of sense. And I think to this day, if you ask Democrats, certainly, what was President Barack Obama's best choice in terms of personnel? The answer would come back Hillary Clinton, because she gave him so much as a cabinet secretary and as a validator of the positions that he was taking because of her own weight within the Democratic Party.
And yet, Amie, she turned him down 3 times. 3 times he asked, 3 times she turned him down. What finally got her to say yes?
I think, when you talk to her, if you asked her that question, she would say that she can't, when the president-elect asks you to serve, you can't say no. And she felt an obligation to serve him and serve the country and serve the party. And she did that, I think for herself, actually. It left the door open for her if she did want to pursue another candidacy. And I think that's how she looked at it.
How did they manage, though, Amie, to get over what was a pretty toughly fought, certainly among the staff, a very bitter campaign? The staff, maybe the candidates not so much, but the staff despised each other. How did they get over all of that in order to make that appointment work?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have a scene in the book, or a quote, where someone notices that they call each other, it was still like an us versus them kind of situation. I think for the principals, for Clinton and Obama, it was quite simple. They're both professionals and they both wanted to make this work. And their staffs took a little bit more. There were scenes, we have a scene in the book where Hillary Clinton tries to court one of Obama's staffers or make nice with him. He's wearing a cast, she's wearing a cast after she hurt her elbow, and she sends him a sling for his cast, and he was automatically won over. I think she felt that there was some tension left over from the campaign, and early on she tried to emphasize the fact that the campaign was in the past. And we also have a scene in the book where the president tells his staff, they make a knock on her in the Oval Office, and he says, "Come on, guys, cut it out." And she had done the same thing with her staffs. But the two of them, it's very interesting. We have a moment in the book when they both attended a climate summit in Copenhagen, and they found out that the Chinese and other countries were holding a climate or a meeting, and they decided to kind of storm the secret meeting together. And so you had the President of the United States and the Secretary of State kind of saying, come on, let's go in and crash this meeting between these countries. And they both, when you talk to them about it, both sides basically point to that moment and say that was the bonding moment between the two sides.
So the two principals, right, the two principals set a good example for their respective teams. That clearly comes through in your book. But Jonathan, I wonder how much did Obama's people alternatively admire Hillary Clinton, respect Hillary Clinton, or fear Hillary Clinton?
I think some mix of all of those things and at varying degrees throughout. I think that, obviously she's a force to be reckoned with, somebody that you should not take lightly as an opponent, somebody you shouldn't take lightly as an ally. I think they very much admired her work ethic. I think they admired the way that she put the past behind her and worked for President Obama's goals, even if occasionally she would stray out a little bit on the tactics. She was very supportive of what he was doing. So I think there was some admiration there, certainly some respect for what she had been through, for her opinion when she voiced it behind closed doors about what to do on policy, and absolutely fear. You don't want to get on the wrong side of somebody who's got such reach within the Democratic Party, so many allies, so many friends, a husband, many of whom your colleagues worked for. A lot of people in the administration were old Bill Clinton hands, including the White House Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, at the beginning. So I think, you put that picture together, this is not somebody to be trifled with, and I think they treated her that way.
And Amie, let's try to get a better understanding of what she actually did as America's Secretary of State. And I ask that because her friend Richard Holbrooke, the ambassador, clearly had the Afghanistan, Pakistan, Mideast file. Joe Biden, the vice president, clearly seemed to be the prime force on Iraq. These were the hardest foreign policy files. So I guess I'm asking, what did that leave her?
I think, when you ask her aides, I think she was, first of all, a loyal foot soldier to the president. And we tell the story several times of how, she really backed him up on in Afghanistan, and several other occasions where he really, in the raid to get bin Laden, Leon Panetta came to her pretty early on and wanted her buy-in. And she was kind of against Joe Biden and Robert Gates in that situation, and she very much backed what the president wanted. So I think that, A, she was that. She also, she came into the State Department when there was very low morale. She tried to really boost morale there. And she tried to, first and foremost, really boost America's morale abroad. We were in 2 wars. She felt that coming in. She really wanted to boost the morale, put diplomats in unsafe places to actually emphasize that. And I think that's one of her big successes. It could also be, when Republicans seize on Benghazi, it could be something that hurts her as well.
We're going to get to Benghazi later, but let me, since you mentioned Osama bin Laden, and Jonathan, move to you on this. Besides being supportive of what the President and his Secretary of Defense were trying to do in that case, namely take out bin Laden, besides being supportive, did she have a role in any of that?
I think actually it's a really important role, and this is why it's important. The Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, was actually at first against the raid. So was Vice President Biden. There were concerns about whether they would be able to pull it off. There were concerns about whether bin Laden was there. And the President was really looking at a decision where his Vice President and Defense Secretary were lined up against him. Had his Secretary of State also been lined up against him, the 3 most important national security officials other than the President would have been against him, and the political risk of going ahead with such a maneuver, he may have done it anyway, would have been enormous. If you think about perhaps that raid going south, and it coming out later that the Defense Secretary, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State had gone against him, I think that would have been problematic for him. I think Hillary Clinton made a pretty strong argument behind closed doors. That's what we're told, in favor of going after bin Laden. She made a moral argument about justice for the victims of 9/11 and their families. I think that was something that swayed some of the people in the room. But basically, and she was in on all of the National Security Council meetings on this, and that's no small number. I think it was something along the lines of 24 of them when all was said and done. So somebody who had heard all the evidence, who came from the position of being a New York senator on 9/11, somebody who really had what sources describe as a bias for action, believing that when opportunity presents itself, you really have to try to take it instead of sitting back and waiting. And I think, what those sources were saying is that the President is sometimes indecisive and needs a little bit of a push. I think all of those things made it important that he had that extra bit of support from her. Ultimately, Bob Gates, the Defense Secretary, swung over in favor of the raid, but only after the President had made the decision. This was not something that had unanimity or uniformity of thought behind closed doors, and hers was the strongest voice, the most powerful player in the room, urging the President to go ahead and make the strike. I think it's no small thing.
And Amie, amazingly, as you tell us in the book, she did not tell her husband. How did she not tell Bill Clinton ahead of time that Osama bin Laden was going to be the target of an assassination at that time?
That's amazing, right? I mean, it just shows the loyalty she had to the president, President Obama, and to the staff. Very few people knew about the operation, including her husband, and we found that a very interesting tidbit. We also tell the story of she's at a wedding. I think that as the raid is happening, and she's at, I think it's a wedding for one of Chelsea's friends actually, and one of Chelsea's friends comes up to her and says, do you think that we'll ever get Osama bin Laden? And she has her fingers crossed behind her back, and she says, I hope so, maybe. so this is actually happening. Exactly.
Yeah. Follow up, if you would, Amie, on this. There are examples you give in the book of where, this is obviously one of the most powerful women in the world, and she gets the little things right. For example, when State Department underlings need places to shower after they've cycled to work. Tell that story.
That's a really interesting story. One of the pillars of what she wanted to do was boost the morale of her employees at State, a 70,000 person bureaucracy. And she took that very seriously, and we tell the story of how she held these town hall meetings for her staff, for all the State Department employees. And one day, someone stood up and said, I'd bike to work. I would really like to shower after I get here. And she actually took notes and took that to heart. And she would follow up in meetings repeatedly. She would ask her aides, so what's going on with the showers? And this is basically, it shows that she's the ultimate retail politician. She cares about these were essentially her constituents. She cared about them. She wanted to see that they were happy there, and she felt like happy employees would actually benefit the entire department. So we thought, it's a small story, but it's actually a pretty significant one.
Let's talk about Libya. I'd like, first of all, Jonathan, to have you tell us what was her reaction when she found out that Muammar Gaddafi, the former dictator in Libya, had been killed.
She cheered. She was taping a segment, I believe, with CBS in Afghanistan, and she applauded having killed him, and it was sort of a "we got him" moment. It didn't play particularly well, certainly with some of the conservative audiences in the United States who felt like spiking the football there was a little inappropriate. That said, I'm not sure that it hurt her any with the American public. Having said that, obviously one of the, well, perhaps the greatest foreign policy tragedy that happened on her watch was the death of the 4 American officials at the embassy in Benghazi. How did she get the news that Ambassador Chris Stevens and his team, 4 of them, had been killed? She'd been getting reports all night that were sort of updating on what had happened. At some point at the State Department, they knew that Ambassador Stevens was missing. Shortly thereafter, a team from the CIA annex had basically found Sean Smith, who was a technology officer, an information officer, found him dead inside one of the burning villas, but Chris Stevens was missing. Information about that was rolling in. There were reports of Chris Stevens being in a hospital. They were pretty sure, sort of late at night in Washington, D.C., that Stevens was probably dead by the time she actually left the State Department that night. And then eventually she got, I believe, a phone call or an email from Cheryl Mills, her chief of staff, confirming that Chris Stevens' body had been identified. So it's interesting. I don't know the exact moment in her mind where she gave up hope that he was still alive, but it was pretty clear to most of the top State Department officials before that official confirmation came in about 2:30 in the morning, U.S. time or Washington, D.C. time, that he had actually been confirmed dead by Americans at the airport in Benghazi. Amie, she knew Chris Stevens. He was her appointment. I wonder whether you were able to determine how guilty she felt personally about the fact that he'd been killed on her watch.
I think it really weighs on her, and you could see it on her face at the time. I don't think anyone would not believe her that she was really mourning the loss. I mean, she felt very, I think she's called this her greatest regret, so her own words. And she, in the days after, she wanted the president to come talk to the employees at State. She brought him over. This was something that really weighed on her then, and I think if you talk to her now, it still probably does. Benghazi has become, to the extent she may or may not be a presidential candidate, a real Achilles heel for her. It's turned into as you folks in Washington would say, it's turned into a thing. It is a big thing for her right now, and I wonder how much legs you think this thing still has. We're going to talk about her potential presidential candidacy a little later, but how much of a thing is it still for her? Well, we're seeing Republicans in recent days making it a thing. I think they're trying to gear up what they will be doing inevitably as the election starts rolling. But the thing is, we already had a presidential election in 2012 post-Benghazi. It didn't really hurt President Obama. It happened under President Obama's watch. I think they will certainly make it an issue. I think she might be able to ride it out. Jonathan, the president asked her to stay on for a second term as Secretary of State, and this time she turned him down and she stuck with her refusal. How come? Well, this is a story that we tell in the book that is one of the many news nuggets, at least it was at the time when we wrote it. Since the book came out, obviously it's not breaking news anymore, but they were on Air Force One over Southeast Asia. The president had asked her whether she would stick around. Earlier that year, he talked to her about sticking around, and she'd said that she planned to leave after the election, that the one term was
pretty much good enough for her. It was time for her to get out of public service, and he had said, well, you know, I'll talk to you about it later. I'll talk to you about it later. And then finally he asks her on Air Force One a couple weeks after the election, and she turns him down, and he makes another pitch, says, well, maybe, he'd said, stick around for a year. She said no. He said, well, maybe for a little while longer. And she said no. And basically her answer to him was that it was time for her to get out and do some things in private life. And obviously she's been doing that as a you know, somebody who's raising money for her family's foundation and trying to give some speeches for money in the ramp up to what may be a second presidential election. So,
Amie, she did, I think by your count, 1 million miles of travel in the president's service as Secretary of State over that 4 years.
112 countries.
Right, a lot of countries.
Yeah.
But people are going to ask, what does America have to show for it? What's the answer to that question?
That's a good question. I mean, there's nothing that she can put on a bumper sticker in a campaign. And I think, you know, when you talk to people, what did she accomplish there? I think, you know, that's something she's going to really have to answer. I think we do point out some of her successes, as I mentioned, that she backed the president 100%. She was able to, you know, Burma is probably a success for her. There are definitely things that she can point to under her watch, but I think that that's one of the looming questions, you know, that she'll have to answer. Like, what are the tangible accomplishments that she can point to?
And Jonathan, the Fox News commentator Britt Hume looked at her record and said, competent, not great. Is that a fair shot?
I think it's a fair shot. You know, for any Secretary of State, you're going to have some time to see how the policies that they put in place play out. It's not the kind of position where you know, like as in a war perhaps, how things are going sort of on a day-by-day or a monthly you know, basis. This is something where you try to put in place long-term strategies to strengthen American relationships abroad, to strengthen American commerce abroad, to you know, to help. Even in the case of war, we think of secretaries of state as diplomats and not people terribly involved in war, but putting together coalitions for wars the way that they are done now, like going into Libya. So there are a lot of things too that you'll have to wait to judge her on. But as Amie said, there's no bumper sticker achievement here. I think Britt Hume's analysis is, you know, if you were to look for some short way to analyze, it's probably not too far off. And I mean, she's not Thomas Jefferson, but neither did she have a disastrous reign as Secretary of State. And I think we'll look back in a few years and see whether the things she planted really took root and grew, or if some of the things she tried to do there were simply pushed aside by her successor, John Kerry, and whoever is his successor.
Well, let's try to understand that a little bit more, Amie, because the public opinion polls showed that she was routinely 20 points more popular than the president whenever these kinds of surveys were done. So presumably the American people liked whatever it was they thought she was doing as Secretary of State. But if, as you point out, there's no singular achievement, there's no Camp David Accords or anything like that for her to hang her hat on, why do you think she was perceived as having done such a good job by the American public?
Well, I think, you know, she kept her head low. There were no really big blunders. I mean, of course, there's Benghazi, but during the time, over the course of her 4 years, there wasn't anything that people could really point to and say, you know, she's really not doing well here and there. And I think that that's basically what we're looking at. But she was also outside of domestic politics. And, you know, she was warned by one congresswoman in a car as they were driving in the United Nations General Assembly. They were heading towards the assembly. And this congresswoman actually says, you know, you're popular now, but wait until you get back into politics, everyday politics. You know, your poll numbers are going to drop. So I think that, and that's exactly what we're seeing a little bit right now. You know, she's out. She's not campaigning yet. She hasn't decided if she's running yet, but she is out. You know, she'll have a book tour coming up. She's making speeches all over the country, even in Canada. And so I think that, you know, I think as she continues to do that, we'll see her numbers maybe drop a little bit more.
We should just maybe take a second, Amie, and remind people, because your system is very different from ours. Our equivalent of Secretary of State, our Foreign Secretary, is an elected politician and very much takes part in question period and is a political force in the government. Yours is actually prohibited by law from participating in politics. Is that right? Exactly.
But, you know, as we tell in the book, she she had she tried to keep her distance from politics, but she was always sort of interested and involved. We tell the story about her involvement in healthcare, for instance. There was a cabinet meeting one summer where she basically rallied all her fellow cabinet members and said, "Come on, guys, let's get together. Let's do this. This is our time. This is our moment." She had seen what happened during her husband's administration, and she wanted to seize that moment. She also talked to some lawmakers to push them to support health care. And that's something I think Republicans will seize on too, depending on the failure or success, how it's viewed, how healthcare is viewed in this country in 2016. I think they might point to this excerpt we have in the book and say, she did have her fingerprints on healthcare, and they will start calling it Hillary care.
Jonathan, let me move to a somewhat different potential explanation for why her poll numbers were so good. I know that if you had done we did do a poll, I remember. There was a poll in Canada when George W. Bush was the president seeking re-election in 2004. And if he'd run in Canada against John Kerry, he'd have got 15% of the vote and Kerry would have got 85. That's the way it looked after 4 years of George W. Bush. So my question is, are Hillary's numbers as strong as they were because she kind of reintroduced a different kind of America to the rest of the world, and it wasn't Bush's America? Did that help?
Well, I think that helped in two ways, and I would just say, I think George W. Bush probably happy that he's not Canadian because he would have had a one-term presidency, if that, rather than 2 terms.
Actually, I think he would have been a zero-term presidency if he'd run in Canada, but that's a different story.
Fair enough, but certainly with those statistics after 4 years, certainly not 2 terms. I think there are 2 reasons, or two things to look at with your question. One is her popularity with the American public, and I absolutely think that that the difference between Barack Obama and George W. Bush and the fact that she was aligned with Barack Obama had something to do with her poll numbers going up. I think the combination of her celebrity and the fact that she was in an apolitical role, certainly an apartisan role representing the United States abroad, was helpful for her with the American public. And I think the fact that she wasn't in the news all the time in the sort of heated political debate was very helpful to her in terms of her numbers. But an interesting thing to look at is the jump in America's perception abroad during the time that she was in office, and particularly that changeover from 2008 through 2011, 2012, where the Gallup organization does polling in other countries to see which countries are most admired and respected. And the United States had really fallen off during the Bush years, and then rose again during the first Obama term to a place where it was perceived best among the countries of the world. Then I think fell into a tie with Germany right as she was leaving, but still was in that #1 slot with a tie, I think. Much different than where they were under the Bush administration. The reason that that's important, I think, is, and these are polls of the public in different countries, the reason that that's important for American foreign policy is that it's a lot easier to get something out of a foreign government if the people of that country like you than if they dislike you. And it's not just America's enemies during the Bush years, it's America's friends, like Canada, as in Western Europe, where there were countries that our poll ratings were terrible, and you saw a real strong increase once Obama came into office, and as Hillary Clinton had an opportunity to sort of spread that message of a different kind of American leadership across the world. I actually was speaking with some diplomats this weekend who were from foreign countries in the United States who were singing her praises.
Okay, let's finish up in our remaining moments on, obviously, the question everybody wants answered, and that is her future. She has, in some respects, Amie, already run for president 3 times, right? There were the 2 terms that her husband enjoyed, and she very much was a full partner in that presidency. And then, of course, the one time she ran for the Democratic presidential nomination against Barack Obama. So she knows better than anybody what running for president entails. What do the tea leaves tell you about whether or not she will go again, this time in 2016?
And I think John would agree, I'm pretty confident she's running. I would say 99% sure she's running. I think something pretty significant would have to happen to keep her out of the race. The entire landscape is rooting for her and calling for her and begging her to come in. Maybe not some progressives who would like to see an Elizabeth Warren, but she has fundraising groups, research groups, everything kind of set up for her. Democrats are already endorsing her. And she kind of wants that. You know, we in the book she talks about how she feels like she was drafted into the last election. She wants to be kind of pushed. She wants to be wanted in a way and convinced to run. And I think she will prove, or she'll have to prove, that this is something she wants to do, not that she's just the inevitable candidate.
Well, that's what I wanted to pick up on, because Jonathan, in 2008, she was considered the inevitable candidate as well. And then this guy, Obama, came out of nowhere and, despite being all of a year and a half in the Senate, knocked her off. There is a danger in being the inevitable candidate, is there not?
Yeah, she turned out to be pretty evitable, if that's a word. Yeah, I think for Hillary Clinton, and what we've seen over the years in poll numbers is when she's seen as an underdog, people seem to like her. When she's seen as the front runner, they tend to like her a little bit less. I think for her, the challenge is going to be how, as a front runner, do you run a race that makes people feel like you're championing the underdog? And I think, you know, that could be done through the prism of the advancement of women. It could be done through economic arguments, but I think she's going to have to find a way to connect with people on a level where she is fighting for them and championing them in some way, because when she just runs as a front runner or the expected candidate, the inevitable candidate, nobody really likes that. And it proved out in 2008, and I suspect you were not going to see her try to run a race for the coronation, as our Canadian friends could tell us. It's not always great to be ruled by a monarch.
Amie, I gotcha. I did want to follow up, Amie, on that one name that you dropped in the middle of that last answer, which is the Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. I saw her interview the other day, and she was asked if she was endorsing Hillary Clinton for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2016 if she ran, and she wouldn't say yes. All she said was, "Oh, I think Hillary's terrific." That's not a yes, and Elizabeth Warren herself knows that the left end of the Democratic Party wants a champion and might want her. Is Elizabeth Warren a threat to Hillary Rodham Clinton's candidacy?
I wouldn't call it a threat. I think that if Hillary Clinton does run, I don't see an Elizabeth Warren running against her. I could be wrong, but I don't see it happening. I think there would be a big push and a big cry to kind of get her out of that. If there is a woman who's going to do this time around, I think most people would want Hillary Clinton. But, you know, she is the one person, as John and I have traveled the country to talk about our book, she's one of the names that we're hearing from a lot of progressives. I think a lot of progressives want to see her run, and they want to see her involved. So I think she's kind of keeping the door open in the slight chance that Secretary Clinton doesn't run for the presidency. I think that maybe she's basically, you know, trying to telegraph to supporters that she might be interested in the job.
Well, I would think, Jonathan, that Hillary Clinton still is a candidate who's, for some in the Democratic Party, too bellicose, too pro-war, too close to Wall Street. She has really not disassociated herself from a lot of the people who were very problematic in the Great Recession. Is any of that a problem for her?
I think it's only a problem for her if somebody runs a credible campaign against her in a Democratic primary. I think all of those things are good for her in a general election, should she get to that stage. So I think that, you know, the challenge for her on the Democratic side is to make sure nobody runs against her, so to make sure that those fault lines are not exposed, or to the extent that they are, it's rhetorical. You can see sometimes things that she says that seem to be aimed at perhaps allaying some fears on the left. But the truth is she's more of an economic centrist than a lot of the people at the heart of the Democratic Party. She is more of a centrist on foreign policy, and particularly being unafraid to use American military power when she thinks it's called for. And I think there are a lot of Democrats, particularly those who lived through the Vietnam War era period, and now those who lived through the Iraq War, who are very wary of deploying American force. And so that's a problem for her on the left, but only if there's someone running against her and making a credible case against her. Otherwise, it's a way for her to show herself to be in the reasonable center, perception-wise, to a general election audience.
Amie, in our last couple of minutes, I want to put one more very uncomfortable issue on the table, and that is her age. She will be, on Inauguration Day in 2017, 69 years old. Is that too old to be president?
I don't think so. I mean, we saw people like Ronald Reagan, John McCain ran.
John McCain lost.
He lost, but he still ran. And I think that, you know, if you see the schedule she has right now, as I mentioned earlier, she's doing speeches across the country. She's traveling. She's not traveling as much as she did as Secretary of State, but she has a pretty rigorous schedule. She just finished a book. So I think, you know, if you look at the schedule she has, she's still very active, and it would be hard for Republicans, and I think it would be a mistake for Republicans to point out her age. I think that, you know, what they'll do instead is say, look at this young crop of Republicans we have on this side. Look at the Marco Rubios and the Ted Cruzes, whoever emerges as the front runner, and say, look at this guy or woman, and look how young and energetic they are, instead of pointing out maybe how old Hillary Clinton is.
Yeah, Jonathan, last word to you. And I guess there's still a great reservoir of sympathy for Hillary Clinton, given all of what she went through as First Lady of the United States, yes?
I think she's lived through a lot in public that most people would never hope to have to live through in private. So, yes, I think that there are times sympathy for her. I think her approval ratings went up, and went up significantly in the wake of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And I think that it's interesting. The American public loves to build her up and loves to knock her down. And so we've seen the sort of cycles of that over the years. And we'll see if she runs for president again, whether they lift her back up or they decide now's the time to knock her down.
I actually wanted to call this book The Phoenix, piggybacking off what John said, because, you know, there has been this rise and fall of Hillary Clinton, and I think we both found that very interesting.
Indeed. We'll see if there's one more rise as the presidential campaign for 2016 nears. The name of the book is HRC, State Secrets and the Rebirth of Hillary Clinton. Jonathan Allen, Amie Parnes, so good of you to join us on TVO tonight for so much time. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.